Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Okay, guys, I'm ready. Hope everyone's doing well. Let's learn. I was asked to react to this. Sarcasmatron. Do a subscribe, preemptive like. How Ukraine's fake culture war became a real geopolitical conflict. Interesting title. Let's go.
What if a full...
Hope everyone's doing well. Original link, top of the description if you want to watch on your own. Go ahead. Let's go.
What if a full-fledged war erupted between Russia and Ukraine? Could a nation roughly the size of Texas stand a fighting chance against Russia's military might? Tom Foreman joins me now. Tom?
As a simple answer, Jake, no. Until the bombs started dropping, no one thought Ukraine was worth understanding. The past 10 years of Ukrainian history have been the site of some of the worst journalistic malpractice of the 21st century, on par with the run-up to the Iraq War. And now, like in Iraq, tens of thousands of people are dying. And now that everyone is paying attention...
Note 1. This story has proven too complicated to fit in 15-minute bites, so this video will rely on footnotes to provide clarification and more detail. It's always an issue with me, with watching videos with footnotes, that it's hard for me to, like, I might have to rewind and read them. Hopefully not too much rewinding. Furthermore, because many popular misconceptions about this topic are better well known than the truth, this video will rely on primary sources and corroboration as much as possible. Both can be found in the description, denoted by the number here in the screen corner.
And they're doing so from a place of zero context.
And this is after the war in Donbass, by the way. This is during.
Wait.
Huh?
Okay, wait. What is the war in Donbass?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked.
And so it's not surprising that even the people who should have known better got so much completely wrong. And so the first question I'd like to ask is, why? Why did everyone assume, most importantly the Russians, that Ukraine was just too divided to fight back?
This area that we've been talking about so much, as the general pointed out, they don't really need to go into this area because it's so heavily Russian anyway. It's a problem for Western Ukraine.
This is one part of a 4-part series. Please subscribe and stick with me on this, because this is going to go some crazy places, but I promise I'm going to show you sides of the story that no one else has showed you. So we start in 2000 with the typical post-communist story. Freedom, misplaced optimism, privatizations, economic crisis, oligarchs, IMF structural adjustment programs, unsteady recovery, and a strongman leader. And in the early 2000s, Ukraine's strongman, Leonid Kuchma, was having a bad time. His bodyguard had just released a secret 500-hour recording of all of his office hours. A recording in which not only did he solicit bribes, threaten politicians, discuss strategies to rig elections, and authorize the sale of an illegal weapon to Saddam Hussein, he also asked his security minister to take care of a troublesome journalist. Which is a very bad thing to be heard saying about a journalist 3 months before his decapitated corpse is discovered in the woods.
Jesus.
People were fed up. But even more dangerously, 2 of Kuchma's subordinates...
The Bennett regime of Kuchma has made it impossible to deal with them in any other way.
But even more dangerously, 2 of Kuchma's subordinates had become decidedly more popular than him. Viktor Yuschenko was a neoliberal economist who had run the central bank in the 90s and developed a reputation for being unusually honest. When Kuchma found his government insolvent and completely cut off by both the IMF and the private sector, he put Yuschenko in charge of finding money. Yuschenko in turn put a woman named...
Sorry, guys.
Yuschenko in charge of finding money. Yuschenko in turn put a woman named Yulia Tymoshenko in charge of finding it in the energy sector. Yulia Tymoshenko had been the oligarch with a near monopoly on importing natural gas from Russia.
Sorry. All right.
Yuschenko in turn put a woman named Yulia Tymoshenko in charge of finding it in the energy sector. Yulia Tymoshenko had been the oligarch with a near monopoly on importing natural gas from Russia. But when the political winds changed, she was pushed out, investigated multiple times, and lost most of her money. So she reinvented herself as a anti-oligarch oligarch.
Isn't that the last name of the Belarusian current president? Tymoshenko?
The politician.
Or is it just a close... Maybe I'm just being dumb.
So she reinvented herself as a anti-oligarch oligarch, the politician who could make the other energy oligarchs pay because she knew the ropes. She managed to close $4 billion a year's worth of loopholes by which energy oligarchs were milking the government dry. And Yuschenko took the money and used it to pay down money owed to pensioners. In a country mired in enough corruption, a tight-fisted conservative neoliberal can become a populist hero.
Бувшому Радянському Союзі пенсію. Вона в 1,5 рази нижча, ніж у білоруса.
If Kuchma was going to win his next election, he was going to need to get rid of the two of them without generating a backlash. So first he tried to split them up by forcing Yuschenko to fire Tymoshenko, and then he put Tymoshenko in jail. When that didn't work, he just fired Yuschenko, but Yuschenko immediately formed an opposition party which immediately went to the top of the polls. And when that didn't work, Kuchma realized he was not going to win re-election. So he decided to pick a successor that could run against Yuschenko. That candidate ended up being his current prime minister, Viktor Yanukovich. But Viktor Yanukovich was a former street tough with no real campaigning skills and zero charisma. So instead of trying to win on charm, he turned the race into a linguistic culture war.
Виктор Андреевич, if you think that you will win and you will become the president of Ukraine, you are deeply mistaken. If you win, you can become the president of part of Ukraine.
Blunting Yuschenko's anti-corruption message by spreading rumors that he was going to split the country and possibly ban the Russian language or even ban the Russian Orthodox.
Man. I'm trying to follow as best I can.
Anti-corruption message by spreading rumors that he was going to split the country. His anti-corruption message.
So why would he both be for splitting the country, which would probably be a good thing for Russia, and also pro getting rid of the Russian language? I'm a little lost there.
By spreading rumors that he was going to split the country and possibly ban the Russian language or even ban the Russian Orthodox Church.
Nobody will be closing any Russian language schools. Third, nobody will be dividing Ukraine into 3 sorts of Ukrainians, as was suggested on placards and posters in Kyiv and most of Ukraine, which were put up, by the way, by pro-government forces. Crimea will always belong to Crimeans and Ukraine. Nobody will be surrounding Luhansk and Donetsk with barbed wire. You're a serious person. Don't repeat these myths. Unity of Ukraine, let's consider it a holy temple, which every politician should guard.
Okay, I think I understand what I was confused about before. He wasn't accusing him of being pro-Russia. He was accusing him of being too anti-Russia.
And when he loses, he shouldn't run to a neighboring country and say, let's play the card of separatism, federalism, let's create a southern and eastern republic.
Now, you've probably heard some things about Ukraine being divided between Russians and Ukrainians, and that's partially true but misleading. In reality, everyone in Ukraine speaks Russian, and about 70% of Ukrainians speak Ukrainian. When people say Russians or ethnic Russians or Russian speakers, they mean the segment of the population that can't speak Ukrainian. The real divide in Ukraine is a three-way split between ethnic Ukrainian nationalists in the far west, the professional middle class based in Kyiv, who tended towards Russian because you needed it to advance in the Soviet bureaucracy, and the Russophone east of the country, which was previously the Soviet Union's industrial heartland and is now Ukraine's Rust Belt. The first group tended towards Yulia, the second towards Yuschenko, and the third group towards Viktor Yanukovych. But since all three of them had come out of the same administration and were all pursuing basically the same economic and foreign policies, Yanukovych was going to need a deeper issue to act as a wedge between Yuschenko and the east of the country, and he found the United States.
The people you liberate will witness the honorable and decent spirit of the American military.
In 2004, the U.S.'s global reputation was plummeting, and Yushchenko's wife was American, so the regime-controlled media portrayed Yushchenko as a puppet of America who wanted to tear Ukraine away from Russia and put it in NATO. This was a weird accusation, because it was Kuchma who had desperately wanted to get Ukraine in NATO, going so far as to send 1,000 soldiers to Iraq as a bribe to George Bush. Yushchenko is a puppet of America who wanted to tear Ukraine away from Russia and put it in NATO. This was a weird accusation, because it was Kuchma who had desperately wanted to get Ukraine in NATO, going so far as to send 1,000 soldiers to Iraq as a bribe to George Bush.
Okay, this is really important. So I'm at 742. Okay, this is really important.
Ukraine
just for my own understanding.
Weird accusation, because it was Kuchma who had
Kuchma.
Rust Belt. The first group tended towards Yulia, the second towards Yuschenko, and the third group towards Viktor Yanukovych.
Oh, God. Kuchma.
And is now Ukraine's Rust Belt. The first group tended towards Yulia, the second towards Yuschenko, and the third group towards Viktor Yanukovych. Weird as far as to send 1,000 soldiers to Kuchma who had desperately wanted to get Ukraine in NATO, going so far as to send 1,000 soldiers to Iraq as a bribe to George Bush. But Kuchma controlled TV, so it stuck, and it attracted Ukraine's anti-Russian far right to Yushchenko's cause. This in turn made the East nervous, not so much because of any worry about ethnic violence, but more because Ukrainian nationalism feels like an attack on their cultural self-identity as the people who liberated Ukraine from Hitler, rather than the people who conquered Ukraine for Stalin. This is all to say that the divide in Ukraine is more like a US-style culture war than a Balkan-style ethnic struggle.
Interesting. Okay.
For politicians and oligarchs, it's mostly just a tool for cynically juking voter turnout. A farce.
Вони будуть прямувати моє ім'я, моїх друзів, що я фашист, що я нацик, що я не люблю Росії. Ви знаєте,
But the Kremlin wasn't in on the joke. Kuchma successfully convinced them to see Yushchenko as a threat. So Russia donated $300 million to Yanukovych's campaign and sent him their best campaign professional.
Whoa.
Kuchma successfully convinced them to see Yushchenko as a threat. So Russia donated $300 million to Yanukovych's campaign.
841. This is important. 841.
And the first group towards Viktor Yanukovych.
Okay.
Professionals. And they $1 million to Yanukovych's campaign and sent him their best campaign professionals. And they started running as many ads as they could for Yanukovych.
Наші діти будуть пишатися Україною.
Дитячі долоні будуть в надійних руках.
See, this is a little confusing / interesting for me because they didn't have so Putin's Russia openly donated $300 million to one of the campaigns, and because they're so closely linked, it wasn't seen as some kind of foreign manipulation of Ukrainian democracy. Because even over here, like even if Canada donated, if the Prime Minister of Canada donated $300 million to a presidential candidate, that would be a problem. But it wouldn't be over here. trying my best to understand.
When that didn't seem to work, Russia got the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church to endorse Yanukovych. And finally, when it was clear that none of this was going to stop Yuschenko, they just tried to murder him.
Doctors confirmed that opposition candidate Viktor Yuschenko was poisoned during the campaign.
He claims to have been poisoned in September.
His face almost overnight changed into a scarred, bloated mass.
The government said he must have eaten some bad sushi.
And so, when even that didn't work, they just decided to rig the election.
The country's election commission ignored reports of fraud, declaring Kremlin-backed Viktor Yanukovych the winner.
The problem, of course, with all those failed attempts to bias the outcome is that they were so
Commission
This is crazy.
ignored reports of fraud, declaring Kremlin-backed Viktor Yanukovych the winner.
The problem, of course, with all those failed attempts to bias the outcome is that they were so transparently desperate that everyone realized they were going to rig the election before they did it. So when there was a 10-point difference between the exit polls and the official returns, no one needed to sit around waiting for an investigation.
Цією нашою командою звертаюсь до вас, щоб завтра о 9 годині ранку на площі Незалежності зібралися
Hundreds of thousands of pro-democracy Ukrainians in the streets today protested against the results of the presidential election.
Demonstrators clashed with police, hundreds of thousands protesting the results of the election and calling for a new vote.
Yuschenko has called for a nationwide strike, warning the country is on the verge of civil war.
If they shoot us,
last night,
if they send tanks, no matter what, there's nothing that can overpower the will of the people.
Kuchma was now forced to choose between a Tiananmen Square-style crackdown or backing down. He backed down and cut a deal with Yuschenko to allow for a new, fair election.
This makes, I've never known this, I guess in history, not in modern history, I've never known this type of clear interference and then clear outrage and then clear resigning. I had no idea about all of this stuff. I really didn't.
And cut a deal with
and
Yuschenko.
It is very startling
to allow for a new, fair election.
Про оприлюднення результатів повторного голосування 26 грудня 2004 року з виборів президента України. Yuschenko Viktor Andreyevich, 15 мільйонів 115 тисяч.
And so Viktor Yuschenko became the third president of Ukraine, and Yulia Tymoshenko was announced as being his prime minister. But this begs the question.
The video could end there and it's already crazy.
But this begs the question. Ukraine was run by oligarchs, and it continued to be run by oligarchs. Was this really a revolution? Yes and no. First, let's talk about what we mean when we say Ukraine is an oligarchy.
Well, it's a damn good start, that's for sure.
Yes and no. First, let's talk about what we mean when we say Ukraine is an oligarchy. When we say America is an oligarchy, we just mean there's too much income inequality, and also we really need campaign finance reform.
Yeah.
And when we say Putin's Russia is an oligarchy, we mean Putin has a bunch of billionaires who have to act as his capos, or else. But in Ukraine, oligarchy is literal. Everyone who gets rich gets into politics. The reason is called parliamentary privilege. If you have a seat in parliament, you can't be investigated and charged with a crime, unless the rest of parliament agrees to strip you of your privilege. And even a legitimate businessman will need that privilege to avoid getting squeezed by a prosecutor with connections to an even bigger oligarch. So it's financial suicide not to run for office after after making a lot of money, either by forming your own party or bribing a major party into giving you a slot on their candidate list. This practice is so widespread that by the early 2000s, oligarchs were buying spots on lists not for themselves, but as speculatory investments. But in Ukraine, there is no class solidarity among oligarchs, mainly because they represent different sectors of the economy and come from different parts of the country, and they regularly attack and snitch on one another in parliament. The Orange Revolution was on a surface level just the victory of one clan of oligarchs over the other, but on another level it was a revolution in a relationship between the oligarchs and the middle class. Because there's no solidarity among oligarchs, any oligarch could immediately ride to power by throwing in their lot with the middle class civil.
That's the thing. Yeah, if you're not united as the rich oligarchs, and you see maybe a problem at first of people rising up, well, if you see that as a way for you to stay in power, to align with them and get rid of others you don't like by portraying them as not aligning with them, then you're going to do that.
Societies. Any oligarch could immediately ride to power by throwing in their lot with the middle-class civil society groups, which means in Ukrainian oligarchy, unlike in Russian oligarchy, civil society doesn't get to rule, but it does get to play kingmaker. And that diversification of power redounded down to the media. The news stations all had to compete instead of colluding. There was just one problem. Yuschenko and Timoshenko don't actually like each other. In fact, they hate each other and are terrible at working together. And the enmity mostly seemed to be personal. Within 2 years, Yuschenko had fired her. And after new parliamentary elections made hiring anyone else impossible, he chose over her Viktor Yanukovich, a man who had previously just tried to murder him, only to again get into a power struggle with Yanukovych, fire him, bring back Yulia after finding no better option, only to get fed up with her again and start trying to illegally call new early elections. On virtually every issue, the three of them ran into gridlock. When one switched positions on a law, the other would also switch, just out of spite. And that didn't change when the mortgage crisis hit. On top of that, Russia began choking off the flow of natural gas to Ukraine in the middle of winter. This forced Timoshenko to negotiate a new natural gas.
This is the problem I see. Let me know if you think I'm wrong. I very well could be. Let me know in the comments. That if you don't have if you have a country that is built on, there's no country in the world that I think is completely democratic and completely uncorrupt. I think that's impossible for humans to do, frankly. It might be a little bit of a pessimistic take, but I don't think any country with human beings running it, obviously, human beings running it, is capable of having a completely uncorrupt government. I don't think that's possible, okay? But there are degrees of corruption. And when the degree of corruption is so high, even when you have movements of fighting more undemocratic outcomes, like was done earlier in the video to get this president in charge, well, you're still in this medium of undemocratic institutions. Again, every country is not completely undemocratic, is not completely democratic. I want to make that clear. That I'm not saying like any country's perfect. Of course it's not. But even if you have a success at one level, even if it's a big success at the highest level of democratically winning, well, now you're put into an office that is still surrounded by old ways of power. And so even the most honest, democratically minded person won't be able to survive in that way. And so I don't see an easy way for even someone democratically elected to stay in power without doing some weird, sketchy things. Does that make sense? I hope.
Gas deal at
let me know.
Ukraine in the middle of winter. This forced Timoshenko to negotiate a new natural gas deal at a much higher price. That deal cratered her popularity, and Yuschenko began openly accusing her of being a traitor and a tool. Russia began choking off the flow of natural gas to Ukraine in the middle of winter. This forced Timoshenko to negotiate a new natural gas deal at a much higher price. That deal cratered her popularity, and Yuschenko began openly accusing her of being a traitor and a tool of Putin. By their last 2 years in government, Yulia and Yuschenko were just actively trying to sabotage one another. This set the perfect stage for Yanukovych to make a comeback. Now that Ukraine had an American-style electoral system, Yanukovych dumped his Russian advisors and got American ones, and they got to work selling him as the perfect candidate to get Ukraine into the EU, which was a core issue for Kyiv's middle class. See, for all the talk about pro-Western or pro-Russian politicians, all politicians have to both keep Russia happy and keep Ukraine on path to European integration. Yanukovych was no different. Why do Ukrainians need the EU when every other country seems to want to flee it? Well, reason one is just empirical. Ukraine looks at a country like Poland, which in the early 90s was in the same place as Ukraine, but is now 3 times richer. Reason two, the EU creates a critical check on the power of oligarchs and their corruption. Joining the EU transforms Ukraine's oligarchs from being big fish in a little pond to small fish in a big pond. If a Ukrainian billionaire bribes or threatens a Ukrainian official, they'll likely get what they want. But if that same billionaire tries the same thing on a European bureaucrat, the response would be something like, "I'm sorry, who are you? Am I supposed to be scared? Yeah, no. Come back when you've killed as many people as Deutsche Bank, thanks." And reason three, even the oligarchs want to go to the EU because what they lose in power, they gain in the ability to go legit and cash out for huge profits. And so Yanukovych used the fact that he was seen as Russia's guy to pitch himself as the perfect leader to get Ukraine in the EU while not setting off Russia. So after he won, Yanukovych got to appeasing the Russians. He signed a 30-year lease for the Russian naval base in Crimea, which would disqualify Ukraine from joining NATO for an entire generation. And just to drive the point home, the parliament passed a law forbidding the president from joining any new foreign alliances. These moves were divisive.
I just want to say, so far,
бійка між регіоналами і нунцівцями. Усе це не заважає спікеру відкрити засідання. У залі реєструється 211 депутатів, менша частина від депутатського складу.
But they passed. But Yanukovych had another agenda. Revenge. Now, let's step back 4 years. When Yanukovych was prime minister, mostly it was impossible to privatize anything because the socialists held key veto points. He was, however, able to bribe the socialists into privatizing one government asset, a massive manor that had previously been a summer house for the leaders of the Communist Party. Yanukovych had managed to sell this place off at a low price to a little-known investor named Viktor Yanukovych. And when Yanukovych and Yulia ran against each other in the 2010 presidential election, she called him out for this and implicitly threatened to renationalize the mansion. So, when Yanukovych became president, he threw her in jail.
Сьогодні я ще на свободі, але завтра вже буду за ґратами.
But that left the question of what crime to actually charge her with, since she had kept her nose clean since entering politics. So Yanukovych used the unpopular gas deal she had negotiated with Russia, arguing that she had agreed to a bad deal on purpose as part of a secret bargain with Putin and had betrayed Ukraine. And Viktor Yuschenko, though he knew better, agreed to play along and testify against her. To the EU, this seemed like major democratic backsliding, so they made releasing Yulia from jail one of the preconditions for EU membership. So to get the EU off his back, Yanukovych funded a massive smear campaign against Yulia, both domestically and internationally. His team shopped out stories to conservative media outlets in Israel, Europe, and the US, making her out to be an anti-Semite and a Putin stooge. You might remember this story because one of the political pundits that took part was Ben Shapiro. But again, the Kremlin wasn't in on the joke, and this media campaign smeared Putin as a side effect of its smearing Yulia, which sent the Russians into a paranoid frenzy. A leaked document from the Kremlin showed that even before shit went down later, they were already convinced that Yanukovych and most of his oligarchs had turned against Russia, and that it would only be a matter of time before there was a second Orange Revolution that would destroy relations between Ukraine and Russia for good. Yanukovych was oblivious to all this, so he went on trying to court Europe for Yanukovych and most of his oligarchs had turned against Russia, and that it would only be a matter of time before there was a showed that even before shit went down later, they were already convinced that Yanukovych and most of his oligarchs had turned against Russia, and that it would only be a matter of time before there was a second Orange Revolution that would destroy relations between Ukraine and Russia for good. Yanukovych was oblivious to all this, so he went on trying to court Europe for a good deal, and it seemed like he was making progress, right up until 2013, when suddenly Russia decides to just start sanctioning Ukraine, and says they're going to keep sanctioning Ukraine until it drops
Now there's a weakening of pressure from Russia. However, if the blocking of exports resumes and the association of the EU is signed, then the Ukrainian economy could lose half to 2.5 billion hryvnias in the half-year. Exporters will lose time at customs control fund due to the possible introduction of an additional customs tariff, but this will encourage exporters to go to other markets.
Out of the EU negotiations. Europe and America treated this as a bargaining war with fairly low stakes. Russia treated it as an existential crisis. Russia's main envoy to Ukraine, Sergei Glaziev, even threatened that signing the association agreement would nullify Ukraine's statehood and would lead to a Russian military intervention. And Yanukovych thinks, okay, so this is clearly a misunderstanding. Since I solved the whole NATO problem, I just need to reassure Putin. So Yanukovych and Putin have a meeting. We don't know what happened in this meeting. What we do know is that immediately after, Yanukovych came to the EU negotiators and said he would need a huge amount of money from the IMF, something on the order of $50 billion, in order to offset something to do with Russia. Because Europe and the IMF didn't know just how strong the threats had been behind closed doors, they assumed this was a cynical cash grab.
If Mr. Yanukovych thinks that the European Union should give him money, he should become very concrete.
This is the problem with oh my God, the hairy situation is the perfect term. You know, is how do you act as someone who's trying to legitimately try and save Ukraine from Russian aggression in a Ukraine that is still very corrupt, and then try and go to the EU in any way that is going to seem legitimate when you might just seem like you're trying to get a cash grab? I don't know. And
that ask how much and in which way and under which circumstances.
And the EU was already inclined to see the Ukraine as more of a burden than an opportunity. So they didn't bite. So Yanukovych walked away from Europe with nothing.
President Viktor Yanukovych has said he's only suspending, not cancelling Ukraine's planned deal on closer ties with the EU and still intends to sign an agreement at a later date. There's no change to our plans. We think we can sign once we get down to work and find solutions for economic problems.
But failure wasn't really an option for Yanukovych. He had won his election on a promise that he would get Ukraine into the EU, and now it looked like he had just been stringing everyone along.
Почему так мало людей? Вот в 5-миллионном городе вот сюда вот пришли только вот полсотни человек.
Півгодини тому тут стояло 50 людей. Огляніться, скільки зараз. І це тільки початок. Сьогодні збереться декілька сотень, можливо, тисяча. Завтра збереться 10 тисяч. Післязавтра збереться 100 тисяч, а потім піднімуться мільйони.
In the Ukraine, thousands of anti-government demonstrators turned out again today, and some opposition leaders called for nationwide strikes after a night of bloody clashes between protesters and police.
Hundreds of thousands of protesters have stormed the streets of the Ukrainian capital in recent days, upset that the country's president, Viktor Yanukovych, walked away from a deal with the European Union after warnings from Russia.
The thing you realize as you watch and read most of the journalism about Euromaidan is that it's almost impossible not to get swept away with the ultra-violent spectacle. Every report slowly bleeds into the same montage of blood-soaked scalps, burning tires, and candid snuff films. So instead I'll try to focus on the politics. Originally, support for the protests mostly only came from the sectors of the country that hated Yanukovych already. But the crackdowns were so excessive, it spread the backlash rather than crushing the movement. And soon the leaders of the three biggest opposition parties had positioned themselves as the leaders of the movement. Those three men were: one, Arseny Yatsenyuk, a young technocrat who had taken the lead of Yulia Tymoshenko's party while she was in prison; Vitaly Klitschko, the former heavyweight champion who ended up inheriting what was left of Yuschenko's base.
He looks like a guy you wouldn't want to mess with physically. Yeah, I could tell already.
Klitschko, the former heavyweight...
Sorry, that had nothing to do with this. I'm sorry.
Heavyweight champion who ended up inheriting what was left of Yuschenko's base after he left the presidency; and Oleg Chernyshov, the slightly creepy leader of the crypto-Nazi Svoboda Party, who had found unprecedented success in the last round of parliamentary elections by moderating his image and by selling himself as a protest vote. And maybe because of all the money and free publicity he was getting from Yanukovych's party in the hopes that Yanukovych could run against him instead of a more formidable opponent. As the movement got bigger and more institutionalized, Yanukovych got scared. So he went a step further and tried to pass an anti-protest bill so vague it could plausibly criminalize just about anything. And that scared everyone in Ukraine. Protests spread to Yanukovych's part of the country in the south and the east. With his political base ready to disown him, Yanukovych had no choice but to start negotiating. Russia took this as a sign that they were right about Yanukovych, that he was going to betray them, especially when they found out the American embassy was arbitrating the negotiations. So they put more pressure on him to break off negotiations and instead end the protests with overwhelming force.
It said remember her, she'll be important later, by the way, if you didn't get that. Victoria Nuland, second Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs from America.
Put more pressure when they found out the American embassy was arbitrating the negotiations. So they put more pressure on him to break off negotiations and instead end the protests with overwhelming force. Yanukovych was trapped between a rock and a hard place, and his own party and security services were divided between hardliners and Democrats. Shortly after, the shooting started.
The police are shooting directly at protesters.
Here, a CNN photographer captures the moment when a group of medics is seen helping a man lying on the ground. There is a shot. One medic falls to the ground and tries to crawl away. We don't know if he survived.
The death toll is still being counted, but in our hotel, which became a makeshift hospital run by volunteer doctors, 13 bodies were brought into reception.
Yanukovych, like Kuchma before him, realized he was either going to have to sign a deal or spark.
Guys, I only started paying attention to even American news, let alone global news, around 2016. And so a lot of this stuff, I'm like, I can't believe I didn't hear about this, but I also really wasn't paying attention. But in the context of the video, it seems like I know hindsight with the war actually happening, invasion of Ukraine. It seems like it should have been a bigger deal. It's with hindsight. Also, I didn't pay attention as much. But
Yanukovych, like Kuchma before him, realized he was either going to have to sign a deal or spark a civil war. So negotiations started to form a new unity government. Yanukovych would stay president, the leadership troika of the protests would get jobs as prime minister and his deputies, and they would all act as caretakers until the next election later that year.
Flanked by European foreign ministers, a stern-looking Yanukovych signed the deal. Of note, the Russian envoy refused to witness it, so the deal stands, but there's no certainty it will last. In a moment that wasn't supposed to be caught on camera, the Polish foreign minister warned the opposition, sign it or else.
And then just
if you don't support this, you'll have martial law, the army, you'll all be dead. Jesus.
And then just before Yanukovych was about to implement that deal, the deal that would have saved Ukraine from chaos, he just suddenly got cold feet.
The president tonight is in hiding, and just look at the images coming in now. Families wandering the grounds of his luxury home outside the capital today, taking turns playing on his private golf course, helping themselves to his golf clubs.
Can I very quickly just ask you, do you know where Viktor Yanukovych is right now?
It's a good question. Millions of Ukrainians want to know where is Yanukovych.
Jubilation on the streets of the Ukrainian capital.
Western media spun this as a story of people power scaring away a big bad dictator, but the truth was much more sinister. While the crowd was angry about the shootings, it shouldn't have been impossible to pacify them once the deal was signed and the Maidan triumvirate was on Yanukovych's side. But one of the annexes of the agreement was that there would be an investigation into who shot who on the 20th, and the leaders of Yanukovych's security forces either thought or were convinced by someone that Yanukovych was getting ready to throw them under the bus. So they decided to betray him first. Someone in the chain of command between Yanukovych and the riot cops ordered the cops to withdraw from all government buildings, and they, along with their boss, just disappeared. They would reappear a few weeks later either in Russia or in Crimea, which was already in the process of being invaded by Russia. There was now no one standing between Yanukovych and the angry protesters except the far-right militias who were acting as Maidan security forces.
This is the problem with the whole atmosphere of the political situation of the country, is that even if you have a democratically political win, well, the next fight you have is just another opportunity for Russia or pro-Russian forces to then influence that, and then again and again. And so in order for defeat it, you have to win like 100 times in a row.
Which means Yanukovych would have to renegotiate his resignation with absolutely zero leverage. Or, he could sneak out with as much of his expensive stuff as he could stuff into a hip helicopter. But for now, all Ukrainians knew was their president had ghosted, and they would need to move fast to prevent the state from collapsing. So even Yanukovych's own party threw their hands up in frustration and voted to kick him out of office and put in a provisional government. Yanukovych showed up again in Russia, claiming the vote to remove him was unconstitutional and that he was still the president, which was probably true, but there's a remedy for that. You come back and challenge it in court. And he was literally refusing to come back because of some phantom assassination plot he refused to explain. Whether this was because he genuinely didn't feel safe or if Russia had his back to the wall, he was now giving Russia the pretext they wanted to deliver on their previous threats.
Никто меня не свергнул. Я вынужден был покинуть Украину под непосредственной угрозой своей жизни и жизни своих близких.
Not that Russia had waited for his permission. Many of the country's news stations in the east are controlled by a pro-Kremlin oligarch, and when Yanukovych fled, they started running scare stories about how the new government was full of Nazis who would make speaking Russian illegal. This spurred protests in the mostly Russian-speaking cities in the south and the east of the country. Then, in a sort of parody of the original Maidan, Russia organized mini-coups in all the regional capitals of oblasts where Yanukovych had won. Using the protests as cover, those new fake coup governments could declare themselves independent republics and then ask Putin for humanitarian intervention. At the time, people thought these were spontaneous protests. We only discovered otherwise because the phone call in which Sergei Glazyev directed and talked about cash payments for the protesters was leaked. It didn't work. It turns out you cannot actually sustain a revolution with 200 paid thugs. That is, except in Crimea, because in Crimea, they had help.
Извините, вы можете сказать, из какой базы вы, из какой страны? Вы можете ответить на какой-нибудь вопрос? Yeah, they don't want to say anything. They're not wearing any insignia, but it's pretty clear that they're Russian.
Spetsnaz units without insignia had simply landed outside the city, marched in, disarmed the police, and simply put the local military installation under a light siege.
To what America is officially calling a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russian troops spreading out throughout the strategic Crimean Peninsula. President Obama speaking with Russian President Vladimir Putin, apparently pulling no punches, although it is unclear what the White House can really do about all of this.
At which point, a referendum for more autonomy was called for May, but then that referendum was immediately canceled and replaced with a new one about joining Russia to be held 2 weeks from now. And 2 weeks later, joining Russia won 95% of the vote, with 90% turnout, which was quite an achievement considering only 60% of the population was ethnically Russian. Up to this point, the stakes of Ukraine's fake cable news culture war had just been hurt feelings. Now the stakes are existential, because one side thought the other were bloodthirsty Nazis intent on killing all Russians and put in power by the American government, and the other saw their opponents as fifth columnists in a foreign invasion. The Ukrainian state was on the brink. People were dying, and Vladimir Putin was sitting pretty. And here's where I'm going to pause, because here is where the actual mystery starts. Putin has conquered a piece of territory Russian nationalists have wanted back since 1991. His approval ratings are through the roof. Ukraine now cannot join NATO, because the NATO charter specifically forbids entry for any country with an outstanding territorial dispute. And Ukraine's nationalists have now suffered a huge black eye.
Okay. you're trying to play rules with someone who doesn't have any rules that they have to abide by. This video, I can't look. This is one video I've watched where I have now learned 99% of what I know about pre-Crimean invasion, Ukraine-Russian relations, and inter-Ukrainian relations is through this video. And so, what do I know? But from what I've seen and learned is that you can't play rules with someone who isn't playing rules. They'll win every time. And now more than ever is if there's going to be a deal with Russia keeping Ukrainian territory, that can only be possible with Ukraine fast-tracked into NATO. Anything less than that is just postponing the next round of Russian invasions. I don't understand what else you could possibly think.
Because
if I'm wrong, if you think I'm wrong, I very well could be. Let me know in the comments, guys, please. I never want to seem like I'm acting like I know the answer, because I don't.
A chunk of territory go without a fight. If Putin walks away here, he walks away with everything he wants. But instead of doing that, he... And now a special thank you to my patrons. Kitten of the Yarn Persuasion, Diana Banana, Big Nove, Diano, Kimma Berry.
Okay. I'm assuming he's just trying to read out his patrons, which I'm always hesitant to.
Tedsville. No.
Is there any message he has at the end here? Okay.
What if a...
This has been a crazy roller coaster for me. I knew pretty much none. Zero. There are some familiar names that came up, but a lot of Ukrainian names sound very similar. And so, to me, as a foreigner, some names sound familiar, but maybe I can be mistaken. This makes American political turmoil seem insignificant. I didn't know. I'm in hindsight, but looking back on it, everything makes so much more sense after this video. I'm already running pretty far, and I don't want to make this into an hour-long reaction. So that was incredible, an amazing video from Sarcasmatron. Fantastic. I'll watch the next video, and then the next one. Captivating. I learned a lot. Please, guys, you're always awesome in the comments. If I said anything you disagree with, let me know. If you answer any of my questions, you're always great with that. I hope everyone's doing well, and hopefully I'll see you guys next video. We'll keep on learning. Bye, guys.